Now that we can make simple shapes and color them in P5.js, let's learn a new concept in programming: variables. A variable is something that is used to store a value. It can be used to store a number, a letter, a word, anything. It's sort of like a label on a value. It's used to make it easier to code. Sometimes we'll have a lot of values to remember, and this makes that easy for us. So let's use it and see what it does. Now, let's say we want to draw a circle of width and height 50, like this over here. And let's just draw it in the center of the canvas. Width 50 and height 50. Perfect. Now, we can instead use a variable and store the value 50 in it. So let's do that. Working with a variable has 3 steps. First, we need to declare the variable. That is, tell the computer that this variable exists. We do that by saying let and then putting the name of the variable. You can call it circus, you can call it pineapple, but let's call it something so that it's easy to remember. So I'm going to call this one. Then we need to initialize the variable. That's the second step. This means giving it an initial value. So let's do this over here in setup. And we're doing it in setup because if you remember, any code that we write in setup runs just once in the beginning, and we want to give the variable an initial value only once. So we'll just say size equals 50 over here. And then the third step and the final step is actually using the variable. So instead of saying 50, 50 over here, we can say size, size. And when we run play, we still have the same circle. Now let's say we want to make the circle smaller. Instead of having to change it in 2 places like we did before, we can just change it in 1 place over here. So I'm making it 20 and it's smaller. Now this is one reason we use variables, right? So that we can avoid writing duplicate values in many places. For example, maybe we had about 20 ellipses of the same size. In this case, it was just 1. But imagine if we had 20 ellipses of the same size. Then we would have had this 50, 50 written in 20 places. And when it came to change the code, we would have had to change it in each and every one place like this. But now we don't have to do that because we'll be using the variable size, and we would just have had to change the value of size. So that's one very important reason for using a variable. But let's do something fun with it. Let's make a simple animation with it. So let's go back to having an ellipse of size 50, and let's move it all the way to the left of the canvas over here. Now let's say we want this ellipse to move from left to right. What would we have to do? We would essentially have to change this x value. So the first time the ellipse is here, the x value will be 0, and then it'll be 1, 2, 3, okay, so on and so forth. So we can do that by using a variable. So let's create a variable called x. So first we've declared it, as is the first step. And the next step is initializing it, and we'll initialize it to 0 and use it over here. Okay, at this point nothing has changed yet. What we're going to do now is we're going to say, inside the draw loop, which keeps running forever, we're just going to say x equals x plus 1. Now what this does is it says, when you come into the draw loop, increase the value of x by 1 each time. So the first time it comes in, the value of x is 0. So the new value of x will be 0 plus 1, which is 1. And then when it comes back into the draw loop, it will draw the ellipse at 1, and it will increase the value by 1 more. So when it says x equals x plus 1, it'll become 1 plus 1, which is 2. And it'll keep on increasing like this, so the ellipse will keep moving. And that's what we have over here. If we want to increase the speed at which it moves, we can increase this number over here. As you can see, it moves faster. Now, once it crosses the canvas, it's going to keep drawing, but we don't see it because our canvas size is only 400 by 400. So there's multiple ways that we can bring it back, and we're going to be talking about those in the next video. But for now, let's play around with this a little more. Now that we have x equals x plus 5, we can make it even faster by saying x equals x plus 10. So I'm just going to take it back to 1. We can also make it move in the vertical direction, that is up to down. How we can do that is we can create another variable y, and we can initialize y to 0. And over here, instead of saying 200 for the y position, we can change it to y. And we don't want it to move in the x direction now, so I'm just going to remove that line. Okay, so we have an ellipse which has x equals 0, y equals 0, and nothing's changing. Now we can say y equals y plus 1 for it to move from up to down. There. Now that we have this, we can even do things like making it move diagonally. Right? If let's say we make y equals y plus 1, but we also change the value of x each time. When x equals x plus 1, we'll now have this ball moving diagonally downwards. You can play around with this. Try and make the ball move from bottom left to top right instead of top left to bottom right like we've always been doing. So think about what is the initial value then. Is the value of x increasing or decreasing? So we'll do one such example where we make it move from the bottom right to the top left now. So to do that, we want the ellipse to start over here on the bottom right corner. So for that, the value of x and y will be 400 and 400. Now if we run this code as it is, you'll see very briefly there is an ellipse that shows up, but it goes out of screen. That's because we're increasing the value of y and x, so obviously it's moving away from the canvas. Instead, if we decrease it, we can see it moving back up now. That's because the initial value of x is 400 and it keeps reducing by 1 each time till it becomes 0 and once again goes out of the canvas. So play around with this, change the values, change the numbers on the x and the y axis, see which way it moves. So this is still moving diagonally but more towards the x direction. Now one last thing that we want to talk about is what happens if we move this background that's being drawn in the draw loop over to the setup loop. Now before you continue playing this video, we request you to pause it now. Think about what will be the output if the background is in setup instead of draw, and then continue the rest of the video to see what the answer is. Okay, so essentially what we've done is we've moved background from this loop into setup, which means the background is being drawn only once now. However, the ellipse is still being drawn forever. So when you press play over here, let's take this back to 1. You'll see a stream being left behind by the ellipse. Now let's make this higher value to see what's actually happening. So you can see the previous ellipses that are being drawn as well. This is because since we've moved the background off to setup, there's nothing that's being drawn between each of the ellipses. So right now it draws the first ellipse over here in the bottom right corner and then draws the next one and the next one without redrawing the background, and so you see the stream being left behind. So that's just something to think about, how we're not actually animating in the traditional sense that the ellipse is not moving, but the ellipse is being redrawn each time. So play around with this, make a couple shapes move in different directions, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you.